For years, Silk Road was the biggest dark web marketplace to exist. With more than 1 million registered users and over $1.2 billion in illegal sales, it would go on to revolutionize the dark web forever. From drugs to hitmen and even firearms, Silk Road had it all. But with its rise in popularity, it wasn't long before federal agencies would notice. This would cause a global manhunt which would last for over 2 years. And at the center of it all would be an ordinary man known as Dread Pirate Roberts. So, how did a former Boy Scout become the most wanted online kingpin in history? Buckle up, as the story of Silk Road is going to be a wild ride. Meet the protagonist of our story, Ross Ulbricht, born in 1984. As a child, Ross would grow up in a loving family and would become a Boy Scout in his early years. He would earn the highest rank attainable, which was the Eagle Scout. Then after graduating high school, Ross would attend the University of Texas, where he studied solar cells. Ross was fascinated by science and would get top grades, which would earn him a scholarship at the Pennsylvania State University. During his time at the university, Ross would join a debating team where they would discuss libertarian ideals. However, this would change Ross's life forever. Ross believed that individuals should have the right to make their own decisions without government interference. But after graduating in 2009, Ross would return back to Austin, Texas. However, he had lost his interest in science and wanted to start his own business. Around this time, he would meet a girl named Julia V. They would move in together and eventually fall in love. By now, Ross had attempted day trading as well as developing a game, but unfortunately both ventures had failed. Ross felt ashamed and thought of himself as a failure, but he didn't give up. In 2009, Ross's downstairs neighbor invited him to launch a business called Good Wagon Books. Both Ross and Donnie worked day and night to make the business work, and after a couple weeks, they had made their first sale. In 2010, after a year and a half of working together on Good Wagon Books, Donnie would leave the company because of a job offer he would receive and accept. However, by the end of 2010, Ross would start to explore beyond the book business. He wrote in his journal an idea that he had for a long time: an online free market where people could buy anything anonymously with no trail whatsoever that could lead back to them. But for now, it would remain an idea. After 8 stressful months, Ross had enough and officially shut down Good Wagon Books in 2011. Now, with a substantial amount of free time on his hands, he would continue exploring the idea of a free market. Ross needed a place to host his site, and what place was better than the dark web? After some research, he discovered a software called Tor. Tor allows its users to browse the hidden parts of the internet, all whilst remaining anonymous. Despite finding a place to launch his site, he still needed a way for transactions to take place anonymously. Debit cards weren't an option since banks log every transaction, which would lead to an individual's bank account. However, with cryptocurrency, this was possible. Bitcoin would allow users to send and receive transactions whilst being anonymous. It was a perfect system at the time. Now, it was time to code the site. Ross would sign up to an online Q&A forum for developers and coders under his real name. He would make a post on it which read out, "How can I connect to a Tor hidden service using curl in PHP?" In other words, he was asking how he could create a website where users would stay anonymous. Many users on the site had responded, and Ross quickly got his answers. On the February of 2011, Silk Road would officially be launched. Ross operated the site under the username admin and would make the first listing, which were 10 pounds of homegrown magic mushrooms. Despite the listing being public, it still needed publicity. He would sign up to multiple forums under the username Altoid. Most notably, he would make a post on a forum which read out, "I came across this website called Silk Road. It's a Tor hidden service that claims to allow you to buy and sell anything online anonymously. I'm thinking of buying off of it, but I wanted to see if anyone here had heard of it and could recommend it." Attached would be the link to the site. His plan had worked, and within days the stock had been sold out. Users who bought the goods were satisfied with the quality and its efficiency. With just a click of a button, users could now purchase any drug imaginable. Silk Road would rapidly gain popularity, and within its first month, $15,000 of transactions had been processed. However, as Ross would spend more time in his room, his relationship with Julia began to weaken, eventually leading to their breakup. Within a few months, the site had generated over $5 million in transactions. Silk Road was a success, but as a result of its popularity, it would catch the eyes of the Department of Homeland Security, and specifically an agent named Jared. Jared had noticed an increase in suspicious activity related to drug shipments entering the US since the launch of Silk Road. So, Jared decided to monitor the site. But around this time, Ross's life would change forever. On the June of 2011, a news media company by the name of Gawker Media would publish an article titled "The Underground Website Where You Can Buy Any Drug Imaginable." The article would portray Silk Road in a positive manner, describing Silk Road as an Amazon if Amazon sold mind-altering chemicals. Within a short period of time, over 800,000 people had read the article, and over 15,000 new users would sign up and begin purchasing and selling items on Silk Road. But as Silk Road grew in popularity, Ross needed a right-hand man, someone he could ask for advice. A man under the pseudonym Variety Jones would be the perfect individual. Variety Jones would assist Ross in a broad range of tasks, including fixing any security vulnerabilities on the site, updating the rules for the users, and occasionally assisting in the promotion of Silk Road. At one point in time, Ross would be paying Jones up to $60,000 per session. By the end of 2011, Silk Road had become the largest dark web marketplace, generating over $2 million per month in illicit sales. As the site grew, Jones suggested that Ross should change his username to conceal his identity. Originally, he operated the site under the name Admin. Jones suggested the username Dread Pirate Roberts. The username was influenced by a movie called The Princess Bride. Dread Pirate Roberts was a character whose identity would be passed down multiple times to different people. The idea behind this username would be to confuse federal agencies into thinking that Silk Road's ownership had been passed down multiple times. By now, it was 2012 and more than 100,000 users had been registered. As a result, listings grew beyond drugs. Now, users had the option to buy fake IDs, weapons, and hacked bank accounts containing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Silk Road was becoming a global success, and by February 2013, Ross's first attempt at hiring a hitman would take place. An employee on Silk Road named Chronic Pain had been working under Silk Road for several months. Chronic Pain had come in contact with an undercover agent who posed as a delivery driver that delivered 1 kilogram of illegal substances. Following the next couple of days, Chronic Pain would be arrested and questioned by special agents named Carl and Sean. Carl would gather information regarding how the operation worked and who was in charge, and even got Curtis's Silk Road account information. After the interrogation, Sean would log into Curtis's account posing as Chronic Pain, but these were no ordinary agents. They were corrupt. There was still roughly 20,000 Bitcoin, which at the time was equivalent to $350,000. The Bitcoin would be sent to the personal crypto wallets, which they would later cash out. Ross had heard on the news that his employee had been arrested. He would also receive a notification stating that a user by the name of Chronic Pain had taken money from Silk Road. He began to feel nervous that Curtis would reveal everything to the federal agents. He needed to think of a plan quickly. However, Curtis was in Utah and Ross was in San Francisco. Ross knew he wouldn't have enough time to stop Curtis from revealing the information, so the only way possible was to have Curtis assassinated. He would reach out to a hitman listed on Silk Road under the username Knob. However, Knob was a corrupt agent Carl. He would message the hitman, "I'd like him beat up," then forced to send the bitcoins he stole back, like sit him down at his computer and make him do it. Later messaging changed the order to execute rather than torture. They would both agree on $80,000. A couple of days later, Ross would receive a photo from the hitman to show as proof that the job had been completed. However, the photos had been staged by the agents. Nothing had actually happened to Curtis, and upon receiving the photos, Ross would reply that he was a little disturbed, but I don't think I've done the wrong thing, finishing the conversation by saying that he would call on the agent again at some point, though I hope I don't have to. But in the same month of February 2013, the New York FBI cyber team would open a case called Operation Onion Peeler. The aim of this case was to locate the server Silk Road was being hosted on and shut it down for good. The true hunt for Dread Pirate Roberts had just begun. In the spring of 2013, a man named Gary Roberts, a special agent under the IRS, came bursting into his colleagues' offices, claiming that he had found the man behind Silk Road. Prior to this, Gary had been searching for several months for any information, but he found nothing. However, the night before Gary came into the office, he would make a simple Google search for any early mentions of Silk Road. Gary knew that the site had to be promoted somewhere before it went mainstream. This would lead Gary to a post on a website called The Shroomery. As discussed earlier in this video, Ross would make a post under the username Altoid where he promoted Silk Road. Gary became suspicious of the user Altoid and made another Google search, which would lead to another post on a different forum called Bitcoin Talk. And in this post, Ross would link his personal Gmail, which was a huge mistake. Gary would search up Ross Ulbricht on Google and found an interview by StoryCorps that featured Ross. By the end of the interview, Gary was convinced that Ross was Dread Pirate Roberts. The following morning, Gary would report the information he found to his colleagues. However, they dismissed the case, saying that there was not enough information to arrest Ross. Despite the dismissal, Gary would continue investigating Ross in his free time. And after 2 years of investigating Silk Road, federal agencies had finally found something. A coding error in the site was found, which would reveal the true IP address of the server. However, the server was hosted in Iceland, almost 2,700 miles from where they were. A small team from the New York FBI cyber team would depart the US and arrive in Iceland. At first, the team thought of shutting the server down, but an agent suggested that they should copy the server, allowing them to monitor the site. As a result, federal agencies had found that the operator of the site would work from public spaces such as cafes and libraries, which would ultimately link back to a user by the name of Frosty, whose activities would match the operator of Silk Road. However, in July of 2013, at Hobby Airport in Texas, several agents from the US Customs Border Protection interfered with a package being shipped from Canada to San Francisco. After opening the package, agents would find 9 fake IDs, all for a single person. Ross's photo would appear on each ID, but the name would be different. The agents reported these findings to the local police force in San Francisco. As a result, police officers would arrive at Ross's apartment. At first, Ross was scared, thinking that he had been caught. However, the local police had no involvement in the Silk Road investigation and had never heard about it either. They began questioning him, stating that you had these IDs mailed to you and you're in the picture. You're the man in the photograph. Ross would comment, "I don't know anything about them," and later mentioned Silk Road. "Well, I heard of this website called Silk Road, where you can buy and sell anything including fake IDs. Shortly after, the police would leave, as there was not enough evidence to arrest them since anyone could have purchased the fake IDs under Ross's photo. At this point, federal agencies had several pieces of information. They had found the locations of the server that Silk Road was being run on, and had a lead on Ross. However, no one was putting the pieces together until Gary met with the New York FBI branch and Jared. On the wall of the FBI office, Gary would notice a board with various leads and key information and noticed that the arrows were pointing to San Francisco. Gary would tell his fellow colleagues that he had a guy he was looking at who lives in San Francisco. His colleagues would record the findings, however they weren't convinced. Later that night, Gary would search for Ross's name on Google one last time, where he would find a newly reported incident involving Ross. Gary had found the 9 fake IDs that had been confiscated by local police. Adrenaline rushed through Gary's body and he immediately called the assistant of the United States Attorney. Explaining his situation, the prosecutor gets all the federal agencies involved on the phone. On this call, Gary would mention the username Frosty. Suddenly, the call went silent. An agent replied, "Are you sure, Frosty?" To which Gary replied, "Yes." The agent replied back, "Well, that is the username who operates the site." To further prove Gary's case, Jared would add that every time he would chat with Dread Pirate Roberts, he would often text the word "yeah." On Ross's LinkedIn and YouTube channel, he would also use the same spelling. Everything made sense now. All they needed was proof that Ross was behind this operation. Federal agencies had begun conducting a subpoena to Ross's Gmail. Essentially, this would allow them to track Ross's activity and collect any personal information stored on the account. Jared mentioned that every single time Dread Pirate Roberts would sign onto the forums or sign onto the marketplace, you'd also see Ross Ulbricht sign onto his Google account or sign off of his Google account. This was enough information to file an arrest warrant. Within a span of 10 days, federal agencies would draft a criminal complaint, get the arrest warrant approved, and fly it to San Francisco. On October 1st, 2013, federal agents would be waiting at a local cafe where Ross would regularly visit. Suddenly, Ross entered the cafe to sit down and work. However, it was too busy, so he left and turned right into the Glen Park Branch Library. The federal agents would follow him into the library. Ross would find a quiet space and sat down in the science fiction section. Federal agents would spread across the library to avoid suspicion. In the optimal case, Ross's laptop should stay open so federal agents can access Dread Pirate Roberts. As a part of the plan, two undercover agents who pose as a couple would start arguing behind Ross. This would catch his attention and lure him in. Out of curiosity, he would turn around to look at the couple, and in a matter of a couple seconds, an agent from the front would quickly snatch his laptop. The undercover couple behind Ross would tackle him to the floor. Ross would try and resist, but he was overpowered. At first, Ross thought he was being robbed. However, it didn't take him long to understand what was happening. At approximately 3:30 p.m, Ross was officially arrested. Investigators went through his laptop and Dread Pirate Roberts was logged into Silk Road. The American had a net worth of $183 million. Authorities would seize fake IDs, electronics, and over $100 million in crypto. The following day, on October 2nd, Silk Road would officially be shut down. As expected, users of the site would go somewhere else, but just 36 days after the closure of Silk Road 2.0 would be launched, and it was a success, bringing in over $8 million per month. However, its success didn't last long, and within a year, the site would be seized. On the 13th of January 2015, Ross would appear in court for the first time since his creation of Silk Road. His defense team would argue that Ross had been framed, claiming that he had passed ownership of the site, but the admins had lured him back in. However, the judges would not believe this, and after 12 days of trial and less than 4 hours of deliberation, Ross was found guilty on all counts. He would face 7 charges, which included a kingpin statute, and would be sentenced to 40 years plus 2 life sentences with no parole. As a result of his crimes, he was expected to pay $183 million to federal agencies. However, that was not the end. As mentioned earlier in this video, the corrupt agents Sean and Carl would also be found guilty for stealing the Bitcoin from Silk Road. As a result, they both would be jailed. The case of Silk Road was history.